So today's session, as you well know from the title, is all about auditing what is and isn't working in your L&D and people efforts. And it feels like a great conversation to have at the start of the year because there's definitely a lot of that energy around at the moment. People really want to achieve more in the year ahead, but there's some cool themes in there that I'm noticing. People want to do more with the current resources they have. They want to be better aligned with other people in the business. And most importantly, I'm seeing a lot of people who want this year to be really meaningful. And it feels like an effective audit is a great starting point for all of that. So pleased to say that I'm joined by Nelson Sivalingham, CEO and co-founder here at How Now, and also Scott Sampson, country manager UK and Ireland at Personio, to discuss how we audit what is and isn't working in practice. Throughout this webinar, if you want to leave questions in the chat, we're going to get to Q&A at the end, so feel free to just fire them over when they come to mind. There's also a Q&A option enabled on the webinar as well. So Nelson, Scott, thank you both for joining me. I want to set some context first of all, and Scott, maybe you can kick us off, but why is auditing where you currently are such an important first step for people when it comes to their people and L&D strategy?
Yeah, sure. I think it's a really great place to start. And I think particularly because what we tend to see is and the kind of companies and people that we tend to have most conversations with are those that are kind of right at the start of a journey of improvement. So typically they've found themselves with an issue to solve or a very obvious symptom in their business that they want to either improve, they want to build on, or that they want to kind of expand out to a wider part of the organization. But what we also see a lot of is that actually that's where companies start. How do I solve this specific problem? And very often, and usually as a symptom of the kind of the way that we go about either fixing a problem, buying a tool, or instilling a new behavior, is that we really try to solve first. So what we see a lot of is people trying to solve a problem without necessarily having done the issue diagnosis or really working out like what is the baseline problem that's led to this challenge that I'm looking to solve. So I think for that reason, having a strong focus on on the audit of what the landscape is, what the desired outcome is, and what you need to do to get there is really important. But I think probably compounding that is the fact that, over the course of the last couple of years, we've seen the economic climate get a little bit tighter. Businesses are thinking more and more about working with smaller budgets and more efficiently. But we all know, and particularly I think in the world of HR and people, smaller budget does not mean a smaller ask. So we're in this position of having to do more with less and be more efficient. So I think for me, it's a combination of those two things, really. It's about what's the right decision to make, which is the right problem for that decision to solve, and what is it that I really need to fix on an underlying level to help do more with less and be efficient in execution.
Yeah. Nelson, I think you'll remember about over a year ago now, we had a conversation about exactly that topic. How do we do more with less in an economic downturn? You made this really great point about the mindset being that it actually presents an opportunity for us as well. And I think an audit plays into that as well. So I'd love to know your thoughts on that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that mindset, you can almost see this in the entire economy, right? When capital was cheap and money was flying everywhere, all kinds of things were being funded and money was being spent on. And so that kind of scrutiny of, does this really matter? Is this really a problem? Kind of goes secondary because the cash is so freely available. And so it's much like you say, creativity often comes out being having these restrictions forces you to be creative. And I think that's what a smaller budget doesn't necessarily mean smaller impact. You can definitely have an impact in your organization. I think in terms of auditing and I think why it's such an important part of developing your strategy, it kind of forces you to think from first principles. And kind of first principles is when you kind of strip everything down to its core fundamental truths. Like, what do we actually know to be true? and it strips away any of those kind of assumptions and biases that you might already have. And so, for example, when you, instead of, let's look at the opposite would be reasoning by analogy. And that's where you do something this year because you've done it for the last 5 years, right? Or you carry on doing something because your predecessor was doing the exact same thing. And that's often what you see. And that reasoning by analogy is higher risk because you could be scaling something that wasn't working, right? You don't know the assumptions that were driving the decision that your predecessor made, or the kind of factors that would have influenced the decision last year might be very different this year. And so what you don't want to do is carry over those assumptions and biases into this year's strategy. And you want to start from those fundamental truths. Now, in order to do that, the audit will help, because the audit forces you to look at, okay, what's actually working? How do I know it's working? And really understand, why is it working, right? And if you understand that, you can discover things that are working that you can scale, right? So you might realize, actually, this thing right now is having 1x impact. If I really double down on it, I could get 10x impact out of this thing that's already showing signs of working. And on the flip side, it can help you identify the things that aren't working, that aren't having an impact. And rather than scaling the inefficiency and the waste of resources that comes of scaling something that doesn't work for yet another year, instead what you can do is really look at, this isn't working, so let me cut it as quickly as I can. Now, the consequences of that are you end up scaling the things that work and save resources on the things that don't, which mean you're having a bigger impact on your business, and you're more likely to get more budget from your organization because they can see that you're adding more value and wasting less resources. So all in all, starting from the point of first principles, enabled by auditing what works and what isn't working, is a great foundation for developing a strategy.
Yeah, I've noticed this a lot in businesses that have a lot of repeat tasks or actions every year, because there's such a volume of things that happen all the time. It's just, well, we sent this email last time, let's just iterate on that email, rather than, like you said, breaking it down to what actually needs to be done. And the other thing I've seen happen in those cases is people overlook the things that are really adding value. So you'll be surprised when you do one of these audits, you go, actually, I'm surprised that this activity was having the level of impact that it was having across the business. And Scott, when we spoke before, you actually described it in a similar way of how you can maximize high value tasks, or the things that really are adding the most value. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think I think particularly with budget constraints becoming and efficiency becoming more and more prevalent in the, in the current climate, and in a lot of businesses, certainly I'm hearing that. I think it's very tempting to get into solution mode kind of almost too quickly, and as I said, and to build on what Nelson was saying as well around thinking about scaling the right things. It's obviously really powerful to think about, how am I going to solve this and what's the best way to do that. But I think the key thing is to actually think about the almost like a total cost of ownership type decision framework. So it's very easy to get drawn into whether it's working with an external consultant, or is buying a platform or a service, what is the what's the kind of path of least resistance, or what's the shiniest feature, or what's the the kind of best benefit I can have. But it's that second layer for me is and we see this all the time in Personio in our decision making, but we particularly when we work with both new and existing customers, it's really interesting when you get into the meat of a project and actually get to analyze the impact on a business from the opportunity cost of dropping high admin burden, low value work, but often getting to understand, does buying the thing that excites me most actually help me do that, or am I kind of just shifting paper around the desk a little bit? So I think one of the ways to really think about this is to actually understand, like, what is the outcome of whatever decision you make. Is buying the cheapest thing, or is doing the thing that's fastest necessarily going to be the best for the business? And I guess that also comes into, and we'll get onto this in a little bit more detail, I think, That also comes down to really understanding what the goals are. So it sort of ties back to what I was saying at the start, and certainly what Nelson is saying about, you know, potentially scaling the wrong thing. If we don't understand exactly what the root cause is and what the problem we're trying to solve is, we can do things that will definitely have an impact and definitely bring positivity, but they might not necessarily free us up from what was the underlying cost. And actually, quite often we see examples of where customers have you know, brought in a product or a service or a partnership that has amplified the result somewhere, but has ultimately ended up in simply adding a cost because it hasn't freed up the underlying problem elsewhere. And very often you actually can't then get rid of that, or you know, you end up with something incumbent in the business that you have to maintain as well.
Yeah. Before we kind of move on actually to that idea of mindset, Nelson, anything you wanted to add before we move on?
No, I think just, I guess, a small point is on the problem discovery, which I really liked what Scott said. And, you know, just to kind of reiterate that, because it's such an important point that we rush to put out an output, right? I think in HR and L&D, there's often this pressure where we feel, I've got to show I'm doing something, right? I've got to show they're giving me this budget. I've got to show something. And so we rush to put out output, right? And that, by output, I mean, you know, let's generate some policies, let's create some courses, right? These are almost material, tangible things that we can show, but is it driving the desired outcome, right? And to what organizations need now that they're cutting back and trying to be more efficient is they need less output and more outcome. They need to see you're doing less stuff, but you're actually having more impact on moving the needle. And to be able to do that, we need to spend more time upfront in problem discovery, right? Speaking to our internal customers, looking at the data within the organization. And so if you imagine we're spending previously, you know, 20% of our time looking at problem discovery and 80% building out the output, or so to speak, solution, we need to flip that, right? It needs to really be the other way around. We're spending 80% and, you know, most of our time on problem discovery, defining the problem, validating the problem, evidencing the problem exists, and then the last mile is getting that solution out and then measuring to see whether you are making a dent on the problem or not. And so I think it's a really important point to take away.
That's a great segue, because I think a big part of this is the mindset or the intentionality as you go into an audit, because you need to have a good understanding of what good actually looks like in terms of L&D and your people efforts and what you do in your business. So I guess the question, Nelson, is what does good look like, and any thoughts on the criteria people should look at when they do that audit?
Yeah, look, fundamentally, what good looks like is anything that drives business success, right? What you're looking at here from HR, L&D is it aligned to business success and business performance, and is it having an impact on that? Now, business performance, let's say we're measuring that based on revenue or profit, it's a lagging indicator, right? So it takes time for us to see that number move. And therefore, if we're only basing our decisions and iterations based on that, it might be too late. So what we need to be looking at is leading indicators that tells us that we're on track, right? We're doing something that's good. Now, if you look at it from an L&D perspective, that isn't, you know, how many courses did someone complete, right? Because the reality is, how many courses someone completed or how much time someone spent learning isn't really a leading indicator for do they have the skills to deliver on business success, right? So we typically recommend a leading indicator there would be skills, right? What skills do you have and don't you have in your organization? And are you building the business critical skills that are going to help you deliver on your business OKRs or on your business revenue number? Much like that, other leading indicators might be things like employee engagement and retention, right? If you're able to engage and keep your best talent, you're able to get the best work out of your best talent, and that will contribute to your business success. And so it's finding leading indicators like that. Another one might be innovation, right? Were you successful at launching that innovative product that disrupts the market? And if you were able to do that, then it's the probability that you're going to deliver on business success and business revenue goals is highly likely. So I think it's really finding leading indicators that are aligned to business goals. And if you're able to move that in the right direction, then it's probably a good thing.
Yeah, no, I really agree with that. I think we set these big goals, but it's sometimes they're so far away that, it would be 12 months down the line. And often we are being asked more often, or we're auditing more frequently. So yeah, I really like that idea of checking the leading indicators first. Scott, from your perspective, how would you define what good looks like as you go into this audit process?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want this answer to come across as that of a politician. I'm not trying to dodge it, but what I will say from the outset is, I think from the HR perspective, there's probably not really one size fits all answer to this question, and I think a lot will, but there are some principles that I think we can certainly apply in most situations. But I think I suppose the first thing, again, it comes down to, what is maybe not necessarily the same as in the last question, what's the problem you're trying to address, but I suppose it's what's the goal that you're trying to get to. So and actually who owns that goal, who's accountable for the actions, and who's accountable for the kind of the end metrics and outcomes. So if we take something like attrition, for example, which can be a problem caused by any number of things. It could be, for example, that people don't feel that they're getting the development, they don't think they're getting the learning opportunities, and they choose to go elsewhere. It's very easy for that kind of topic to become something that the rest of the business feels HR owns. HR should where HR should provide the systems and the tools and the education to stop that from happening, or to reduce it, or to have a plan in place. And that's true to an extent. But I think it's kind of all too easy for that to become for that to become overwhelming for HR, or for the burden of that accountability to fall solely with HR. So I think for me, good looks like having a very robust and clear plan about accountability, ownership, and what different levers are contributing to that problem, whether it is attrition, or whether it is any number of other things, and to actually agree to a framework about who's going to do what in the overall solution to that problem. Because we can do any number of things to influence, but ultimately, if we don't change behaviors, either positive or negative, cross-functionally or in wider parts of the business, there is only so much that systems and policies and tools and principles can achieve, and the business needs to buy into that overall. So I think for me, good looks like having a very, very clear understanding of exactly the endpoint that we want to get to, with cross-functional exec, SLT, and management buy-in to that. And where that starts to derail, and again, my bias is towards people evaluating multiple providers and looking at buying tools. But what tends to happen is we see one person leading a project with a little bit of support or input from other people, but actually in a lot of instances it's quite an unfair burden and responsibility to kind of put on one person to find the right solution and recommend to the business. Because ultimately, whenever that recommendation comes, lots of people and different stakeholders will have an opinion, and all of a sudden stick their hand up and say, I don't like this outcome, or the knock-on effect that this is going to have. So I think good looks like start with the buy-in, start with the overall view of where you want to get to, start with objection by exception, and build the path to the outcome that you want to get from there.
I like this idea, this ownership point. I think is an interesting one, because I think traditionally, there are a bunch of activities or responsibilities where people would say, "Oh, that's a HR thing, right? That's an L&D. They own that." But actually, I don't think that works, and this might be a bit controversial for how companies operate today. But the reality is, when you look at let's say shared services, let's just take L&D for example, right? It's not a case of a manager spots underperformance in a team and says, actually, they need to develop skills X, Y, Z. That's not my problem. It's L&D's problem. If they said that, it wouldn't make sense, right? The ownership doesn't sit with L&D. What L&D or HR, I see as their role is to actually enable and reduce the friction in these things happening. But fundamentally, the ownership sits with the manager and the individual, right? And there are different variations of this playing out. And I think that it's very, very important when going back to Scott's point around having a clear structure of accountability and ownership, is that you don't end up in a position where essentially HR and L&D could become scapegoats for certain things not happening in the organization. But actually, they are just playing the critical role of enablers and taking the friction out of the process. But the ownership of the deliverable of that outcome happening, it needs to fall on the problem owner. And the problem owner is the manager who needs certain skills in their team, and they need to see a performance from it. They are the problem owner. And therefore working in collaboration with L&D and other members of the HR team to be able to make that impact. And so I think it is a really important question to ask around your ownership structure, because many a times the companies we work with, L&D is solely owned by L&D. They are accountable for any type of learning happening in the company. And if people don't have the skills they need, then it's L&D's fault that they didn't. And that doesn't work. And I think you end up with a bit of a blame game and shifting accountability and passing the buck, which isn't healthy for getting to that desired outcome.
Yeah. I mean, one way we can turn that around is actually a great starting point for the audit, Nelson, which is to sit down with people, do that proper discovery process of the problems, and really build a shared understanding, shared clarity, and a shared problem to solve together, which means, I guess, everyone is accountable. So as a starting point for the audit, how important is it to do that customer discovery part?
Yeah, it's huge. It's like if I was building a product, and which I'm selling, but I never spoke to my customers to see whether it was actually solving their problem or not. If I told you that's how I was building a product, you'd think that's pretty crazy. You don't know if your product is working. It's the same, right? When you look at it, you've got internal customers. You're providing them with a product, right? And that product could be anything from an onboarding experience to upskilling initiatives to a learning platform where they can access learning research, whatever it is that you're offering. They are hiring your product or service to get a job done. And so unless you're speaking to your customers to know whether it's actually helping them get that job done or not, how would you know if it's working? And so in terms of figuring out and going about auditing what's working and what's not, one of the primary things to do is to speak to your internal customers. And from an L&D perspective, that could be from speaking to the problem owner, right? The problem owner gives you a different perspective of, actually, I can see that this problem is being solved and there is a positive impact coming in, to what you might call your direct beneficiaries. So the employees who are engaging with your learning experiences, engaging with your learning platform, speaking to them about, are they able to discover relevant knowledge or learning? Are they able to connect with internal experts, etc.? Now that gives you, that qualitative data gives you the narrative, right? It gives you the narrative to say, what I've been doing is having an influence on this person's performance or in solving the problem. Then you back that up with hard data, right? This is where you go to your quantitative data to look at. So let's say you're trying to improve sales performance. You're trying to cut the sales cycle down from 9 months to 6 months, right? And you can look at the quantitative data that tells you whether that's happening, right? And you can then look at the quantitative data. If in your organization you're measuring skills, you'd be able to go into your skills dashboard and see, okay, I can see skills around negotiation, skills around product knowledge has improved. And at the same time, the sales cycle has also dropped. Now, you might ask me, well, Nelson, that doesn't mean L&D is the only one that's had an impact on that metric. It doesn't have to be. No one's asking L&D to be a solo hero. They just want to know L&D's had some influence on that happening. And to build the narrative around that influence, that's where the previous qualitative data, where you had those conversations with internal customers, you've had a whole bunch of employees saying, I changed the way I negotiate in a deal based on this thing I saw in a program that I went on, or based on the mentoring that I got inside the organization. That changed the way I did negotiation. That quantitative and qualitative data is enough to build the narrative to show you what's working and what's not working.
Yeah, No, I agree. And we'll get onto a little bit around maybe how that can be used to tell stories internally later, which I think is a sort of follow-on part from the audit. But Scott, from your perspective, what do you think is that good starting point, or, any thoughts as well on what Nelson just shared?
Yeah, in the main, I would I really would just echo what Nelson said. I think it's there's and I think there's a question in the Q&A in there as well, directly about this. I think the key thing to avoid here is, and obviously this is going to depend on the size of an organization or an org within a business. There are natural limitations to how much time we have to consult with very large groups of people. Some businesses will have greater budget or capacity to do that using tech or different tools than others. Just keeping that question in the Q&A in mind. But I think the biggest mistake I see businesses make, and very often we speak with customers who may tell us that this has happened in their business, or who kind of realize during a change process, is that they make an assumption. They see some patterns in data, or they run with qualitative or quantitative, but not a combination of both. So to Nelson's point, it's really about that, validating the problem you're trying to solve, but validating that what the right outcome is. But I think some of the best examples I've seen of really good issue diagnosis, really good audits, is how your people actually feel. Because no matter the size of a business, and yet again, acknowledge that not every business is going to have the capacity to ask everyone, and not every opinion is going to be right. But the people in our business are the ones who are speaking with our customers, or they are the ones who are trying to fix a product or change a code or deal with a new piece of legislation, whatever it might be. They are the people dealing with the problems that the business is facing. They're the ones that need upskilling. They're the ones that need more knowledge. So they will know where the biggest gaps are. So I think it's for me, and it's also, frankly, a really easy way. It's not easy to do, but it's an easy and fast way that you don't have to necessarily spend a lot of money on to drive engagement. The number one thing most people care about is, do I feel valued? Do I feel cared about? And does my opinion actually matter? And is the business going to listen to it when it's valid?
Nelson, I'd love to get your thoughts on this question from the Q&A as well. And for the benefit of anyone who's listening to this after and can't see what the question is, it's around being in a execution-driven startup and not necessarily having the budget to bring in an external partner for an audit. And the challenge being that an audit can be a massive undertaking for someone in that position. And it's hard to convince leadership that they should spend 80% of their time in that problem discovery phase. So what would be any tips on that starting point where you're kind of battling this maybe like time constraint, or, a challenge of getting buy-in for that mindset of we need to spend longer discovering problems because the culture is about execution?
Yeah, there's a lot in that question. I'll try to break it down, but I think the first thing to say is to start small, think big. I think often when we think audit, it's like we got to do a big bang audit. We need to review every touch point, every single initiative, everything we're doing. And if you do that, actually, anytime you have a project that's really big and it's going to take a lot of time, how your external stakeholder, how your other stakeholders and C-suite look at it is, the longer it's going to take, the more risk that's baked into it. But it's because it's going to take longer for them to see the perceived value of that, especially in the current climate. So if you said, oh, this is now going to take me 12 months to be able to show you value, that's like, oh, there's a lot of chance this could go wrong. There's a lot of chances we might never get to this value. Versus if you said, actually, in the next 4 weeks, I'm going to be able to do an audit on just this slice of what we're doing and show you this is working, this isn't working. Now, the perceived risk in 4 weeks of work, and the opportunity or the chances of you going wrong and straying off is a lot less. And so they're more likely to give you the budget to say, actually, yeah, let's see how this plays out. And so there is an element of starting small, building the data. And we often talk about flywheels. And it's a bit like a flywheel here. To get it off, to get it turning takes a lot of effort. but you've got to build that momentum with every turn. And that's how I would approach this audit process. It's not a big bang audit, but you start small and you start to collect the data and build it out, looking at different parts of the employee experience that you offer. Now, in terms of bringing in expertise, of course, like if you've got the bandwidth, then absolutely try to bring in expertise where you need it. That's key, because I think it's very, very dangerous to outsource your problem discovery stage completely, right? I'd rather you outsource your solution design and development rather than the problem discovery, because you get to deeply understand the problem. But the side effect of it is you build relationships across the business, right? And that's almost the unquantified side effect. That's a very positive side effect, because through speaking to internal customers, trying to understand their problems, trying to define the problem, you're actually building really strong relationships within the organization. And it helps you build your brand. It helps you build your internal HR brand and L&D brand in the organization. So I definitely recommend not, if you are going to outsource it, I would outsource parts of it, but not it completely. And so it's definitely doable on a lean budget. It just requires a different approach, where you take a more lean approach, where you start small, iterate, collect data, and build a proof of concept, demonstrate the value, and to get more buy-in from your senior stakeholders.
Yeah. From experience, I've seen that as well. You don't need to audit every activity at once. You can do it broken down by an activity basis. And I've experienced it, and of other people doing it, but you don't need to convince every stakeholder at once as well. You know, people are probably going to be more bought in, people are going to be more resistant. So could you start with the people who are already sort of advocates and sort of ready to partner with you and build it up over time, like you said, a bit like the flywheel? It's a nice segue to the next question as well, actually, because we wanted to talk about how tech can help people with this audit. And I think that does play a part, especially for small teams or people with limited bandwidth. So, Scott, maybe kick us off. How can people bring in tech to audit the environment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I think there's been a couple of questions on this already, in terms of KPIs and also tools like AI for this kind of exercise. So you know, I think there are any number of ways that that we can go in terms of utilizing tech for this kind of project, and the number of different tools and vendors and stuff that are out there is almost endless. So I won't sit and take everyone through that kind of list. But I think one of the key things, and this is going to sound very, very simple, but we see this happening way too often, is to, I guess, first of all, make sure that you don't have duplication of effort going on. You know, a lot of the data that we would look at in auditing, in general across HR, not just learning and development or performance and development, it can be quite subjective, right? It's quite difficult to measure people's opinions just purely by drop down, because if they feel that drop down doesn't capture their overall sentiment, they may be less inclined to answer honestly. We can see participation rates drop off. So I think one of the things that we see as being really useful is obviously looking at surveying tools for understanding what's going on in the business. But the big thing for the big thing that we see a lot of customers have success with is when they're able to join up the transference of data between particularly kind of HR and finance, when they're really able to understand what are the activities that we are as an HR function spending time on. So obviously one of those KPIs could be the proportion of HR as a proportion of the business. So for us, there's there are a whole load of different tools out there that are useful for short-term time tracking, project completion rates, etc. But I think the big thing is any existing tool in the tech stack, or any existing ability to measure utilization rates of what you're actually currently spending money on, because very often you'll find that what you think, and it comes back to an earlier question in the chat as well, and in the Q&A, I think what you tend to think or have a hunch at the start of a project, or seems to be the kind of anecdotal sentiment of the business, is actually very often not what the data tells us. So again, it comes back to making sure we're comparing that quantitative and qualitative, research and validation into what we're looking at. So where I would start, and I'm more than happy to share anyone that wants, like it. I've got a whole bunch of resources on different tools that we can use for analysis on this. But one thing I would look at is there will be tools in most areas of the business you are already using. Lean on those tools and vendors and providers to give you analytics on usage and give you analytics on login rates, engagement rates, download rates, how much time you're actually spending, how often you're pulling records from one system and transferring them to another, the accuracy of those kind of comparisons give us a really good insight into where we've got problems. We've actually already got solutions that we're not properly utilizing, because don't rule that out. Doing something net new is not always the right thing. And then lastly, where we've got risks.
Yeah. Nelson, from your perspective, what is the role of tech, and any advice on people for kind of auditing their tech environment as well?
Yeah, I think tech can play a significant role in taking out the friction and time and effort required from you to be able to audit and figure out whether something's working or not. And so what tech you use, much like what Scott said, really depends on what you're auditing, what's the initiative, what part of the business, etc. But to give you a very specific example, within L&D, so going down to what does good look like in L&D, I think we genuinely believe that what organizations want is skills. They don't want content, right? And so they're measuring whether you're having an impact or not as an L&D team based on, are you helping me as a business build the skills I need to be able to hit my revenue targets or growth targets? And so in terms of being able to audit whether some of your learning programs and initiatives are working or not, it would be to measure skills. Now, this is where historically has been a very, very difficult thing to do. And the kind of non-tech approach would be, you need to first build a skills mapping. What skills should this person have based on their job role? And traditionally, you would bring in an external consultant who would sit there for 12 months building out this jobs to skills mapping. And then that would go into an Excel file, and it would live and die in an Excel file, because the thing is, it gets launched, but no one really goes back to that Excel file. It doesn't get updated, or if it does, it's like someone's full-on job to be able to do that. And that's just the mapping. You still don't know to what degree of proficiency does this person have this skill, right? We know they might have negotiation as a skill, but we don't know, are they a level 3 in negotiation, or are they a level 5? So we don't know where our strengths are, and we definitely don't know where our gaps are. And so it becomes very difficult in that scenario, if I was evaluating some of my L&D efforts, to know what's working, what's not. And this is where technology, for example, this is where we help our customers at How Now. So we use AI to build that skills mapping. In this day and age, you don't need a consultant to do that. What we do is we look at millions and millions of job adverts to be able to identify what the most in-demand skills are for any particular job. So if your job is L&D manager, in real time, we could tell you these are the skills the market says that you need to have. And then we also use AI to look at your work history and make an inference that, well, if you've done these 3 jobs in the last 10 years, there's a good chance you would have acquired skills X, Y, and Z. So what would have taken 12 months of a consultant to do, you can now use AI to instantly build that mapping to say, this is your job, this is what we know about you, these are the skills that you should have. And then within HANA, what we have is a built-in 360 skills assessment tool, which basically combines self-assessment, peer assessment, and manager assessment to give you an average proficiency score for every skill that you have. Now that you're measuring skills, it becomes easier to use this tech to demonstrate the impact of what's working, what's not working. So if you've just done, a learning campaign to improve product knowledge, and when you started, the average proficiency was a 2. In 6 months' time, you measure it and it's on a 4. That gives you the skills metric that you need to be able to build that narrative to say, look, I can see it's working because I've increased the average proficiency level for this from a 2 to a 4. And that is where tech has taken out all of the heavy lifting you would have required to be able to capture, measure, monitor, and then demonstrate your impact using that metric. So that's an example of how you can you can use tech like How Now within that setup to demonstrate the value of what you're doing in L&D.
Perfect. We're going to get to the Q&A after this next question. So reminder to everyone who hasn't dropped their questions in there yet or the chat, feel free to do that now. And to make sure we have time for those questions, I'm going to ask you for your best piece of advice for people scaling what's working. So Nelson, maybe kick us off. That best piece of advice, now that people know what is working, what's some of the ways they could scale that?
Yeah, I think an overlooked skill in kind of people, HR, and L&D is marketing, right? And marketing is a critical piece for getting engagement with the initiatives and programs that you're working on. And so my kind of best practice I've seen from companies who do this well is marketing around awareness, and I think that's in two parts: awareness of the problem, right? If the employee or manager isn't aware that this problem exists or there is such a problem, they're not going to be driven to find a solution, right? So the first bit of marketing within HR and L&D is to make them problem aware. And once they're problem aware, is to make them solution aware, right? And when you're making them solution aware, what's very, very key is you need to be able to explain what's in it for them, right? What's in it for the employee? What's in it for the manager? They don't care what's in it for you as the L&D person or the HR person. They want to know what's in it for them. And that's when marketing plays a big role in terms of communicating what's in it for them and driving that engagement. And other marketing tactics you can leverage are things like social proof, right? We spoke about it earlier, Gary, but if someone's engaged with your learning experience before and they've given you positive feedback, turn that into a case study. It just needs to be a one slide where, look at this, Gary went on this mentoring program and he came out a better marketeer. And that social proof gets people going, well, I want to be like Gary. I want the same thing. So let me engage with the same learning experience. So social proof is a great marketing tactic for doing that. Another easy win is call to actions, right? And you might have done a great job saying, look, this is what you're going to get. This is the benefit if you engage with this initiative. But then your call to action might be something boring like learn more, right? Find out more. Right? Why not the call to action? Make it around, join today and become a better copywriter. Because, that's the call to action. So these are small things you can do that can help you really scale the impact of what you're trying to achieve. So my takeaway here would be marketing, right? Is really become that marketeer for everything you're doing in HR and L&D.
100% agreement from me, unsurprisingly, Nelson. Scott, how about yourself? What would be your best piece of advice for then scaling the things that you know are working?
Yeah, I think that the scaling question it's one of those topics that, and it quite often ends up being used as a buzzword in the wrong kind of context, and to be clear, not here. But I think before we can scale, it's really important to make sure that we've identified the right fundamentals, the right baseline operations or processes or behaviors, and that we then have them in place repeatedly in a way that could be trained into other people if that's if it's a behavior or a skill, or in a way that could be rolled out across a wider audience, for example. So I think or a wider user group or a wider customer base. So I think for me, it really is about making sure the foundations are in place before it then gets amplified. So first, it's make sure that you are actually in the position to scale. Once you're at that point, it's very easy to slip into the trap of this goes back to a point Nelson made earlier, a trap of measuring the wrong things. Like if you measure the wrong thing, you're going to get the wrong result. But equally, it's very easy to then put more effort into or scale out the wrong thing. So I think and this is something that like working in sales and kind of go to market, particularly closely with other customer teams, I hear a lot of. A challenge in our it's quite a common challenge with HR as well actually, though, but a challenge in our domain is how do we know that the metrics or the reports or the data that we're looking at is actually up to the minute, and we're not taking a static view, which then becomes out of date. So I think until you can get to the point that you know that the measurements you're taking, or you know that the results you're seeing are reliable and are repeatable, then until then you're not really in the position to scale. But I think once you are, for me, there's kind of two elements to it, and it comes to the I'm not sure who came up with this originally, certainly not me, but you manage process and you lead people, and both process and people are very, very important. They're both interlinked in scaling. So I think for me, with the process, there are some, and again, this is going to sound kind of basic, but how often do people actually sit down and write down and then methodically list out the tasks in order that are going to get them to the goal? So I think for me, like a really repeatable way that has always worked and will always work to do this is to begin with a checklist. Like, what is the baseline target you're trying to get to from that scale? Is it take the pass rate of a new L&D initiative, or a new learning, from average of 60 to 80% from 100 to 1,000 people? It could be anything, but start with what the measure is, and then list out the metrics that get there, because very often people will start with the metric rather than the outcome, and list out the things that need to happen, the behaviors that need to happen, the deliverables from each team, and measure along the way. And when you see the results come through, you're very quickly able to see where you're off track and get and very often ahead of time. And scaling doesn't just happen by getting everything perfect and then launching it. It's not a measure twice, cut once, and then just leave it run. Scale requires adjustment along the way. So you have to have those checklists and those balances and measures in place to be able to adjust as you go. And I think with the people, the thing I would say goes wrong most often is most businesses, and we're really guilty of it in any quota carrying or customer facing role, or project delivery role. What you'll see most businesses do is celebrate the outcome, and very, very seldomly do they actually celebrate and call out the behavior that is required to get to the outcome. Because you don't always get what you want, you don't always get the result, but if we are consistently calling out the behaviors and the adherence to our culture or our company principles that are what we've asked for, even if we get what we want or don't, then we're more likely to get it in the future. And I think that is the one thing I would say for people to remember, is scale doesn't happen because you designed it and then hit the go button. You've got to tweak, and you've got to be prepared to change on the go.
Perfect. Thank you both. Like I said, I want to get to the Q&A in a second, but you would have heard a bit about How Now and Personio throughout this conversation, and a little bit about who we are. But if you want to know more about what either of our companies and services and products do, then you'll see a poll pop up very shortly. And if you click yes to any of the options there, then someone from our team will be in touch with you to share that information with you. We'll move to the Q&A in a sec. So if you do have any questions, there's a couple already in, but feel free to share them. I think we'll start with this one from Ollie, because it's about the skills mapping that you mentioned, Nelson. And it often requires people to be vulnerable, because they'll need to share, personal experiences perhaps, or, they might have to share feedback or receive quite honest feedback. So not everybody might feel comfortable going through that process of the skills mapping and measuring. So I guess any advice or thoughts on how you can manage that relationship and that idea of the vulnerability? You're on mute, Nelson, unfortunately. I hope it's not gold.
Sorry. I missed it. It was a gem. No, there are quite a few things you could do. I'll maybe touch on one or two. I think the first one, it's absolutely valid point in question, Ollie, and that does put into question around what organizational culture do you have, right? Like for example, from an L&D perspective, would be, do you have the psychological safety for someone to learn something new, practice it without feeling the fear of repercussion, and then to get feedback from their manager, and then to iterate and try it again, right? Do you have the psychological safety for that? And that comes back down to when you're measuring skills, right? People need to feel the psychological safety of, what are we doing this for? Right? Are you going to do this to penalize me? And that's where it comes to the next point, which is, what's in it for them, right? They don't care that you're measuring skills because you want to know what skills are in the organization. They need to know what's in it for them. This isn't around saying we're not going to use this, to decide how much you earn and all of those things. That should be measured on performance, right? That should be measured on, are you doing your job well? Do you show the potential to move in your career? But what you need to tell them is you're measuring skills so you can better support their growth, right? Without knowing what skills they need support on, what are the gaps that they have, they can't tailor the support as an organization and as a manager to better support them. So I think it's a combination of making sure that what's in it for them is clear, right? You're doing this to help them, right? We've all seen the statistics where one of the most common reasons why people leave their organization till today is still the lack of growth opportunities. And if you work backwards, lack of growth means they're not building the skills to grow in their career. And if they're not building their skills, that's because of the lack of engagement in learning to build those skills to grow in their career. So if you work backwards, it starts with that. And so you need to explain it. In order to support your growth, we need to help you build the skills you need to grow. And to do that, we need to engage you with relevant learning. And to engage you in relevant learning, we need to know what skills you need. And so once they understand that and you're doing it for them, for their benefit, and you also work on bringing those right elements into your organizational culture, like psychological safety, the combination of those two things should help you move in that direction. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is clear what you need to do to be able to move in that direction.
Yeah. Feels like as well, to your earlier piece of advice about that customer discovery process, if you're sitting down with people and there's a genuine interest in finding out actually where they want to go and what problems they're facing, you kind of build the foundation for having that relationship that you mentioned. We've sat down and discussed the big problems you're facing. I'll take that away and actually try and tackle that from first principles to bring the solution to you. And therefore, maybe that's the early sort of part of it as well. But Scott, any thoughts from you on this kind of vulnerability and the skills part?
Yeah, definitely. I think that this is a topic that I'm really, really passionate about, and I would hope my team would say that to at least to some extent I'm able to kind of deliver on this. They might not. Some of them are on this call. They can probably drop in the chat how much they agree with this. I think the first thing, and it's a really good point Ollie raises, and it's something we've been working very hard on internally at Personio as well. But we recently in the business unit that I sit in, we brought in an external coach to work with our management team. And one of the things that that he said the other day was, how often do leaders actually sit down with their team and understand their goals? And their objectives are different to their goals, right? So their objective could be win X number of clients or transform this area of the business, whatever it might be, but their personal goals could be buy a house, go, like have X amount of money in the bank to do a renovation. It could be anything, anything personal. And I think the answer is probably not very often. So, being able to really understand exactly what it is that motivates your individuals probably removes a little bit of a barrier to that vulnerability. But that, for me, the obvious one is being vulnerable yourself. Like, I don't think there is, for me, some people might disagree, I don't think there's anything wrong in showing your team, your peers, your colleagues, where you yourself have insecurities, because we all have them. So I think being able to do those two things is really key to helping people open up. And one client in a previous business did something on this kind of, particularly on skills mapping, review, etc., that I thought was unbelievably effective. Difficult to organize, but worth it. Was that they actually had a non-management aligned objective review process. So, people that we manage are, with the best will in the world, we're all going to have inherent biases, and we're all going to think, one person in our team is excellent at this skill or always delivers because they did that one time. So I think the combination of being able to, it doesn't need to be by other people within the business. It's difficult to organize that. I get that. But I think making sure that there is some sort of objective framework in place as well, and that people understand that they can contribute to that and be measured on that is important.
Brilliant. think we've got time for one more, so I'm going to take this one from Penny in the chat that's really interesting, but suggesting that maybe L&D teams need to work more like a go-to-market team. So for anyone who doesn't know what a go-to-market team is, they're the team that brings products to market, and they discuss everything from sort of the marketing to the sales strategies, everything that's needed to make that happen. And the point is that people in your organization are the market you're bringing the product to. So any thoughts on maybe operating like that? Penny mentions that they're very collaborative as a necessity, go-to-market teams, but generally speaking, viewing your people as the market and the product you're bringing that's learning or people strategies. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably take that even further and say, L&D and people teams need to almost be operating like a lean startup, right? They are the founders of a startup where they're building the product and they have to take it to the market. And I think that's why it probably needs to be more where the go-to-market teams aren't necessarily developing the product that they're taking to market, right? They're taking a product to market. And that's definitely one of the fundamental skills L&D and people teams need to have and to be able to do is to engage with the internal customer and get it to them and make sure it's delivering value. But they also need to do the other parts, right? They also need to do the product development, so the problem discovery and develop the product. And by developing product, I don't mean building stuff yourself, right? It doesn't mean you've got to go create your courses and create a training program. Curating is also creating, right? And so developing that product, but also they need to do the customer success part of things, right? They also need to go, I put this out there to the market, and are we delivering success? And that goes back to where we started, which is how do we measure success? And different teams, different stakeholders will have a different measure, and then they need to play the role of a customer success manager, sitting there to go, are we helping you deliver that success or not? So it's not an easy job being in the people and L&D teams, but the reality is they need to. And it kind of touches on what Penny's following question around skills is. So you can imagine if the professional who needs to do all of these different things needs to be quite rounded in their skills. And I think what your traditional L&D teams have very much come from either a HR background or from a learning and development, instructional design, learning design, and L&D. But I think, which is great foundation. But I think what we need to develop is those other skills that, like the go-to-market skills, the customer success skills, the product development skills, and that product mindset, and to really be rounded L&D professionals and in a more comprehensive L&D team. So yeah, I'd say almost approach it as a lean startup yourself.
Perfect. Scott, how about yourself? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think the thing for me would be, I would completely agree with everything Nelson said there. I think for me, the critical measure is how you think about the results, right? So the key difference between a learning and development and a go-to-market team is, whilst they're both business critical, in a go-to-market team, there's just no gray area. You either hit your number or you didn't. You're either having a conversation with the CRO or the CMO, or you're not. And I think where they both have a kind of result orientated focus in mind is, where we're at is never good enough. We're always wanting to improve. So I think to Penny's point, that collaboration is key. Like the best functioning go-to-market teams in ours at Personio, we're constantly looking at this concept of not being but finding right. There are any number of ways that you can blame each other for something not going the way that you want it to go. There's the age-old marketing isn't giving us enough pipeline, sales isn't closing enough, and everyone's heard that. And I think if the L&D function can get more to we might not like what the truth is, but let's find what the truth is so we address the right problem. That is probably the way I would think that other functions could work more like a GTM org.
Perfect. That's a great note to end on, because I think it really does hammer home that point of being aligned and also auditing to understand what is and isn't working. So just want to say a massive thank you to you both for joining for a really interesting conversation. I can see from the chat that everyone else really enjoyed it, and thanks to everyone who left great comments and advice for each other in the chat as well. So much appreciated. So thanks again and have a great day.